Welcome to Short Course, episode 113 for October 13th, 2023. I'm your host, Ben Barry. As you can hear, I'm somehow still not completely over whatever this flu, cough, cold, whatever it is that I've had. It just keeps, it's the sickness that keeps on giving. So I have not been practicing or shooting really anything in the last few weeks. I'm just trying to get over this cold, keep up with work, and keep up with the kid. So I was trying to think about what would be a good constructive topic to talk about on the podcast tonight. Something that isn't, I feel like we talk about a lot of politics and drama, and there's a time and a place for that. But honestly, there really hasn't been that much going on in the past week or two to cover. And so I was just trying to think of what would be something, a topic, something constructive, something about potentially improving the sport and moving it forward in, not one of the traditional topics that comes up all the time, production 15, what should nationals look like, that kind of thing. I mean, I think those are all important topics, but they've kind of been hashed to death. I think everybody kind of has their opinion on them, and I don't know that anybody really is changing their mind at this point. Although, who knows, maybe people will be persuaded. But something that I've just kind of been contemplating is this idea of the rules of USPSA and the fact that there are sort of three categories of rules. There are things that USPSA requires, there are things that USPSA allows, and there are things that USPSA bans. And obviously this is true for any kind of sport. Any set of rule set basically to some degree will fall into these three categories. And I mean, some rules kind of are both. So for example, in USPSA, at least in the handgun rules, or what used to be called the handgun rules that are now I guess they just call them the competition rules, because handgun plus PCC, all scoring steel targets have to fall, which sort of by inverting that says static steel targets aren't allowed. Now you can have static steel no shoots and static steel hardcover. So there's a little bit of gray area there, but for the most part, when you think about scoring steel targets, they have to fall. There's no such thing as steel targets where you're calling hits to score them, which is allowed in, it's the whole basis of steel challenge, but it's also allowed in multi-gun rules, where in that case, it's more of a logistical challenge. I think that you typically see that with, I don't actually know multi-gun well enough to be sure. I don't know if it's a requirement that only rifle targets can be static steel that's called, but that's generally where you'll see it, where it's just not realistic to have somebody go reset 100-yard falling popper, that's a rifle target on every stage. So that's an affordance that's been made there. So you can look at that as a rule where what is required is scoring steel must fall to score. By inverse, in the handgun rules, static scoring steel is not allowed. You can look at, say, what start conditions are allowed. There are certain things that are banned. The competitor may never start touching magazines, touching ammo, or touching the gun. So, there are just certain start positions, like, say, hand on the gun in the holster. It's just not allowed. But, within what is allowed, we tend to see sort of the same mix of start positions in different combinations. You might have holstered, unloaded, holstered, magazine in, empty chamber, and then obviously loaded and holstered. You might have empty on the table. You might have loaded on the table. You might have laying on a table, magazine in, chamber empty. And so, you kind of get permutations of these, but they're all within this relatively narrow bound of what is allowed, which basically exists in the space between what's required and what's banned. Another example is, so in other sports, you might see a stage gun or a pickup gun or something like that in the stage where everybody has to shoot some rounds with a gun. And, some matches will do that off the clock, and then you start the timer and then you shoot with your gun. But USPSA says, no, none of that. No shooting multiple guns. And again, I'm speaking specifically of the handgun rules. Obviously in multi-gun, you are allowed to handle and use multiple guns, but I believe even there, stage guns are not allowed. But again, my knowledge of the multi-gun rules isn't that complete, but I believe it's just one of those things you don't see at USPSA matches, which is somewhat, or at least used to be somewhat common at other matches. And, I think that's a pretty reasonable one. I think something like a stage gun where all the competitors don't have an equal chance to sort of be familiar with the gun. Well, like let's say Nationals says, well, we're going to have a stage gun and it's going to be a a Glock 19. Well, okay, now there's this element of, oh, do I need to find a Glock 19 to practice with if I want to be prepared for nationals? And so there's a competitive equity aspect to stage guns. So I think that's one of these rules that it makes sense to just say, no, the competitor competes with their own equipment, just what they bring. At least on the clock. I mean, like I said, I've seen, I want to say it was maybe Three Gun Nation or something. There were matches a few years ago, I feel like I remember seeing, where there would be some kind of stage or demo gun, and you would basically have to fire a couple of rounds and then set the gun down, and then you get the start beep. So the firing the gun was off the clock, but it was sort of a distraction. It wasn't a significant thing if you could just brush it off and get back on your plan. But if it rattled you for some reason, then it was just one more thing to sort of mentally test you. So an interesting example of something that recently went from not allowed to allowed was the rules change in March of this year that allowed fixed time medium courses. And this previously, you were allowed to have fixed time standards and fixed time short courses. And this was expanded to medium courses. And this is a part of a sort of fad or trend that we've started seeing, primarily because Nationals has started having some of these fixed time, not quite field courses, but fixed time small stages with a few positions. And so, it's a novelty. It's a new thing. It's outside the mold. And so a lot of major matches, you're seeing at least one of these fixed time stages that is a 2 or 3 position short or medium course. And for reasons that maybe I'll go into on another podcast, I actually don't think that concept adds much to the sport, if for no other reason than the fact that there is no ability to specify different fixed times for different divisions, and trying to set a single fixed time for all 9 divisions, 8 handgun and PCC. It's just anything that's going to be challenging to open is going to be impossible to revolver, and vice versa. So there's this element of fixed time that I think has its downsides, as well as just the fact that I don't really see the point of stopping the shooter halfway through and forcing them to stop shooting. It's like, if the person already loaded, they made ready, they loaded their mags, they came to the match, like, why not just let them finish the stage, and then whatever their time is the time. When I look at any of these fixed time field courses, I look at it and I say, to me, it would be better Comstock. But I know that's a controversial opinion. A lot of guys like the novelty. They say it provides a different challenge. You get to pick which targets to skip, which, really, that's the only strategy you have is, do you want to shoot the hard targets or do you want to skip them? But leaving all that aside, what I think is interesting is the fact that what we have seen is when options like that have been added to the sport. And again, this is a very small change to allow fixed time medium courses, but we are starting to see more of those. Obviously, stage designers, and I can say this as someone who's been a stage designer, you're always kind of looking for ways to inject some novelty into your stages. And in a lot of cases, this comes from trying to find novel target arrangements or interesting challenges to present with the same old props. But, when the rules come along and say, hey, you can just declare this stage to have a certain set of rules, well, there you go. There's some free novelty. You can kind of make a stage that's different. Is it better? In my opinion, in this case, not really, but it's certainly different. And the reason I bring all this up, and I've discussed this before on the podcast, but I have been involved as a co-match director at an indoor match here in Raleigh for a little over 2 years now. And my role is, the part of the match director that I do is all the stats and all the stage design and checking the setup. These days, the setup crew is so good that by the time I get to the match, they've got everything pretty much in place. And, at most I have to, as I've gotten better at sort of marking my intention on the diagram, there's been less and less that I have to tweak. But just walking through the stage and making sure that what I was imagining made it onto the ground. And what has been interesting about this match, it's an indoor match, and we have 2 bays, and we set up 4 stages, 2 on each bay. And the design is that basically I design, typically on one of the bays, I'll design sort of a full 22 round field course, something like that, with 3 or 4 positions. And then somewhere within that, I'll find a way to break up a set of targets. Maybe I put some shooting boxes off to the side outside the shooting area, and I sort of make a smaller stage that's maybe 12 rounds typically. And that side of the range tends to be fairly prop heavy, because when you've got 8 or 9 wall sections like what I'm working with, sometimes it's better to just use all 8 and make one kind of really interesting stage. And then on the other side of the range, use maybe one or two walls just as sort of visual dividers, and then otherwise build stages where the challenge is less in the physical construction of the stage and more in the stage brief. And again, this comes out of this props restriction, but also to some degree just the limitations of the range and the angles and whatnot. And so over the years, I've had to, and I think had the opportunity to get creative. And one of the things that I like about this match is, as I've said before, we run it as an outlaw time plus match. So we basically just have, one page of basic scoring and safety rules, and then pretty much each stage is just whatever the stage brief says it is. And so over the years, I've kind of tried to come up with interesting ways to use, to make an interesting stage with nothing more than 3 target stands and 3 barrels. And so, sometimes that'll look something like having a card on each barrel, and, the cards are face down, and maybe it's, a 1, a 2, and a 3. And at the barrel, you turn over the card, and that's how many shots you fire from that barrel at each target. Or, you'll paint symbols on each target, and, you turn over the card, and that indicates which target you shoot from that position. So, those kinds of things where you can come up with something that is an interesting challenge, but doesn't require barely any props at all. And what is completely critical is fair to every shooter, no matter which draw of the cards they get, and is not overly difficult to administer. So you can pretty easily tell, okay, they're shooting at the left target, the right target, or the middle target. You're not doing this from 50 yards away where you can't tell the difference. You're close enough to the target that you can kind of see if they're shooting the right target. And then, at the end of at the end of the stage, you walk down and you score the target. And if the target has the wrong number of holes in it or something, well, then you just score the holes on the target. So I always try and come up with these to devise these so that no matter what the arrangement of the cards or, whatever draw the shooter gets, it's not like there's a lucky good order and an unlucky bad order where you get, the hard target from the closer shot and you get an easy target from further back. So typically the barrels are all in a line, so the shots are equidistant, that kind of thing. But, to some degree, there's some creativity there. There are options. The one stage, gosh, it's probably been over a year since I did this. I should probably reuse this idea now that I think about it. But I just had a stage where you just started standing behind a barrel and the timer just started on the barrel in front of you. And to start the stage, you press the button on the timer, and then you had to move downrange so the RO could pick up the timer and follow you with it. But again, it was just one of these things where that's not a legal USPSA stage, but I thought that it kind of added just a little bit of variation. Was it a challenge? I don't know. I mean, but it was different. It definitely threw some people for a loop, this idea of, start the stage whenever you're ready. So there was sort of some room for novelty there. I also, was this last month, the month before, I had a stage where you drew the gun and there were 3 targets at 7 yards or whatever. The shooting difficulty was not high. But you shot each target once, did a mandatory reload, shot each target twice, and then had to do a second mandatory reload where you put the mag that started in the gun back in the gun. So basically the idea was, what was implied by the stage brief is, when you do that first mandatory reload, do it in a controlled way so that as you're taking that magazine out, you're either setting it on the barrel in front of you, on the magnet on your belt, putting it in your pocket, whatever you want. But the challenge in front of the shooter was just to have this little element of gun manipulation where you weren't just doing a speed reload and grabbing the mag out of your pouch. You had to take the magazine out of the gun, and not in a sort of IDPA stow it in your clothes kind of way, but you had to control where it went just enough so that you could retrieve it later. I thought it was a pretty interesting stage. People found it pretty challenging. It was only 12 shots. Again, the shot difficulty was not high, but it was an interesting test of gun handling and just being able to do slightly unusual tasks using sort of familiar operations, but in an unusual order. So those are some of the things that I think are just kind of neat. I don't know that adding stuff like that to USPSA would really fundamentally change it, but some of the other things that I've done, 2 in particular come to mind. There's a couple of stages I've set up using, we have a wall with a port in the middle, and I'll just, in the stage, the way it's built, all shots fired through that port have to be fired strong hand only. And so this is a way to add the element of strong hand in a way that is freestyle, in the sense that I can construct the stage so that you can go to the port at different times in the stage. Maybe you go, to the back left and the back right, and then you finish in the middle at the port. So you're finishing on the strong hand. Or if you're more confident in going to strong hand and then reestablishing your 2-hand grip and coming back to shooting with 2 hands, then you can do that It sort of like makes it's almost like a low port where you can choose, do you want to go to the low port and then get back up, or do you want to end your stage on the low port? And similarly, I've done other stages where in the one I'm thinking of, it was a box to box stage. There were basically 3 boxes, and one of the boxes, all shots had to be fired strong hand. But I've also thought about, and again, I got to design my stages for this weekend, so maybe I'll do this. Basically, just having sort of a separate shooting area where, hey, you've got this big shooting area where you can shoot everything freestyle, but any shots fired from this other shooting area, whether it's demarcated. Ideally, if this were USPSA and we were writing rules for it, maybe you would have to say the fault lines have to be a different color or have, some kind of demarcation like that. But however you do it, make it so that there's a sort of sub shooting area or second shooting area, however you want to term it, where all shots fired. And again, you'd have to get really careful with the wording. Is it if 1 foot is in the shooting area or both feet? So you'd have to, adjudicate it. You have to come up with a way to adjudicate it, but have a way to integrate one-handed shooting into a stage. And this is in contrast to the current USPSA rules, where basically the only 2 options for mandating one-handed shooting, one is at the end of a medium or long course, you can specify that the last 6 shots must be taken one-handed, either all strong hand or all weak hand. Or you can have a stage that does require movement and mandates shooting with one hand, but it has to be Virginia count and it has to be multiple strings because it has to be a standards exercise. So, for example, I think it was Carry Optics Nationals 2 years ago, maybe last year, there was a stage where it was 6 or 7 targets, and the brief was string 1, shoot everything once freestyle, mandatory reload, shoot everything once strong hand, and it was like a 3-position stage. So you had to, each string, your time was, it was 8 or 10 seconds. It was significant. And then the second string was the same thing, shoot everything with 1 round, mandatory reload, and then weak hand, shoot everything 1 shot. But again, because it had to be a standard exercise, it had to be Virginia count, which to me undercuts part of the value of one-handed shooting. I want people to be able to call bad shots when they're shooting one-handed as though it were freestyle. So to me, the standards exercise way of enforcing one-handed shooting, in addition to the whole having to be 2 strings, the fact that it has to be Virginia count to me is just not interesting. In general, I find Virginia count not interesting. We should be encouraging people, if they call a bad shot, if they see a bad shot, fire a makeup. That's what, not this mandatory, oh, you don't shoot any extras because, then you'll get in big trouble. It just, to me, it doesn't add anything to the sport. Encouraging people to call their shots and not having to be overly careful before they break every shot, but, take just enough time, but no more, that whole element of speed. So anyway, those are the 2 ways to have stages with movement. There's also the third way you can mandate one-handed shooting is a speed shoot, but a speed shoot has to be all from 1 position. So that's not really what we're talking about here. On the flip side, in IPSC, they can just declare that the whole thing for a short or medium course has to be shot one-handed, which to me, I think that's somewhat better. That gets us more to the ability to have Comstock freestyle one-handed shooting tested in stages. But to me, that this idea of, if we can come up with a set of rules that can be fairly administered, whether it's, both feet in a certain demarcated shooting area or all shots through a given port or other stuff that I haven't thought of. But just this idea of having a way to integrate one-handed shooting as a freestyle element of the stage, again, similar to a low port or a lean or something like that, I think there's interesting options there. And so it's one of those things where, right, the old proverb about the young fish swimming along and the old fish asks them, how's the water? And they're like, what's water? Right? We get so used to swimming in this milieu and shooting USPSA stages that we don't even really think about things like stage guns, which, at least when I shot more IDPA, were somewhat common. And all these things that we just kind of forget that they're options. And I don't think that we should throw the doors open. Like I said, I don't think stage guns add interesting competitive options. So I don't know that I don't necessarily want to allow everything, but I do think it's interesting to sort of look at all the things that are not allowed in stages, where it's basically, we have decided there's no way you can build a fair, interesting, challenging, competitive stage with this element in it. And, if that element is something like static steel where you have to call hits, I actually don't entirely disagree. The idea that steel has to fall to score and then it's unambiguous. Either it fell or it didn't. And there's no arguing over, I heard a ding, or, here's a little, like there's an element there where, yes, just saying static steel for handgun matches is just a no-go. I'm fine with that rule. Now, I don't necessarily understand the rule that says plates are not allowed to be used at level 3 and 4 matches, which again was one of the rules added in the recent rules update. To me, if plates are unreliable, they should be banned at all levels. I don't understand why only allow them at lower level matches. We've seen that they can be used responsibly. I mean, I think the irony was not lost that this rule change went through 5 months after the World Shoot, where I think there were something like 50 falling plates in the match, and from what I heard, there were no issues because they were built with solid bases where shooting the base wouldn't cause the target to fall over. So, what this all comes down to is I do think that the core flavor, the core spirit of USPSA, IPSC stage design as it exists is generally good. But it is interesting to just think about the fact that we do have these restrictions on certain things, that the rules are basically saying there is, like I said, there's no fair competitive way to establish a stage that includes this element in it. And I think if we sit down and say, is there a way that we can come up with a way to fairly adjudicate, a way to, all shots through a certain port or all shots from a certain box have to be shot one-handed, just as an example, but just to think about the rules that we sort of almost sometimes forget are there, and just think about, are there options for making USPSA more, to use a word I hate when it's applied to gear divisions, more inclusive in the sense of allowing but not requiring certain things of stage designers. And part of what plays into this thought process as well is looking around at other sports or rule sets, things like, say, tactical games, or things like Finish and Desert and Woodland Brutality. These other matches that have gone outlaw because they don't, they want to do stuff at their match that is different from what is sanctioned under any conventional rule set. And I mean, honestly, my little outlaw match has basically done the same thing. And just looking at those things and saying, A, what can we learn from them? And B, if we wanted to have a way to incorporate some of those rules into USPSA or allow variances, right? Say, your typical USPSA match, X, Y, and Z isn't allowed, but this is a level 2, or, we've gotten approval. Just like you get approval for your stages, you can get approval for some kind of rules variance where you can say, yes, this particular stage is not technically legal, but we've gotten it approved by NROI, and it's, we've proven to them that we can administer that, we have a plan to administer this in a fair way, and they've signed off on it. To me, that would be a great way to start experimenting, a great way to let matches and match directors come up with ideas, but have them sort of filtered through some kind of information clearinghouse. And obviously for my purposes, I would just love to see what is going back and forth. I would love to see what variances other people are applying for, what ideas they're trying to apply. And, obviously, in my case, it might be, okay, I'm going to build a stage and the port marked in green, all shots through the green port have to be one-handed only. And if I get to sign off on that, and then we run it at a match and we see how it goes and we report back. And this sort of would provide a breeding ground or a source of ideas for, hey, here's something that's actually starting to get some traction that people find interesting. Let's find a way that we can incorporate it into the USPSA rule set. Because I definitely think that we tend to think that we've got the best thing going. And I don't think that USPSA looks around and says, hey, what can we learn from the other sports the way that we might? And so, to me, that's one of the reasons, like I've said before, that I really actually enjoy running this outlaw match, because it gives me this opportunity to design stages in a very different way from the stages that I design for our level 1 Sir Walter Gun Club USPSA match, because those, in a weird way, I have a lot more props to work with. I have more space to work with. I can use steel, where at the indoor match, we have the plastic falling plates, which are great, by the way. Highly recommended if you're running an indoor match, get some. But I have more resources at the outdoor USPSA match. But in a lot of ways, the the scarcity of resources, the fact that sometimes I'm just out of walls, or I have to come up with an interesting stage using a single 8-foot wall and a single 4-foot wall, because that's, according to my props budget, all that was left over when I designed out this, the bigger stage that I wanted to sort of force a certain type of movement or a certain sort of flavor of stage. To me, having to get creative in those limited constraints is actually kind of fun. And I think I've actually come up with a few interesting options. I'm sure there are dozens more out there. I mean, people are putting on matches all the time, especially outside of USPSA. People put on, outlaw and IDPA matches. I mean, a lot of these go to the place, turn over the card type stage. I saw that first at IDPA matches. And, there are just tons of ideas like this out there. And I think it would be a good thing, when we look at how much people have picked up on this fixed time medium course idea. I think if we could continue to, once a year, once every 2 years, just look and say, hey, are there other interesting things that other rule sets are doing, or that, outlaw matches that we're seeing at outlaw matches? Can we find a way to build that into USPSA? Because the way the rules are now, they ban quite a lot. And some of those things are reasonable. The IDPA stage from however long ago, where you had to start with your magazines unloaded and on the clock, you had to stuff bullets in your magazines, and like the game was, how many makeup shots do you want to put in your mags? Like, no, that is stupid. But could you, one of the rules that is common and you see sometimes in other sports is the gun starts loaded with a certain number of rounds. Would that be interesting to have in USPSA? I don't know. I mean, that's not something I've used in my outlaw match. I've never really played with it, but certainly one of the things that we do use in the outlaw match is the idea that you just have to reload somewhere during the stage, which, is there a problem with that? Could USPSA have a rule that says on short or medium courses? So basically, in USPSA terms, because our medium course only goes up to 20 rounds, where in IPSC it's a 24-round medium course. But in either scenario, in a shorter medium course, most divisions these days, carry optics, limited optics, are not going to have to do a reload. Would it be interesting to say somewhere between your first and last shot, you have to stick a reload? For the purposes of my outlaw match, we do that a lot, because part of the goal is to equalize gear to some degree. You can bring your big sticks, but you're never going to shoot 20 rounds without a mandatory reload anyway. So there's not really an advantage to it. You can practice with that gear if that's what you compete with and that's what you want to shoot with. But the way the rules are set up, having the big sticks isn't an advantage, because it doesn't really save you from having to do any reloads. Someone with stock 17-round magazines will do the same number of reloads as someone with 24+1 extendo flat follower 140 millimeter magazines, or even 170 or whatever. So all of this to say, I think it is interesting, and something that I contemplate from time to time, of what would it look like if we actually looked at, in a measured, constrained way, did start looking at what interesting options are we not allowing for stage designers that we could allow. And I'm talking about things more than just, let's have fixed time long courses, like shoot me now. That's not what I'm talking about. But other things like, is there a way that we can integrate skills like one-handed shooting, or whatever else, you guys are thinking about? A lot of times you'll see stage designers do really elaborate stuff to require you to carry an object through a stage. Is there a way that we could do one-handed shooting in that way, where it's just defined in some clearly enforceable way in the stage brief, so that the competitor knows what is and isn't allowed? ROs know it's pretty clear whether or not to give a penalty. Like, that's the key. I don't want to introduce a bunch of gray area, because I do think that has been the goal. I think that's what USPSA has optimized for, is have rules that are as clearly enforceable as possible and don't allow for any gray area, such as, like, which target was I shooting at through, from this box, or, that kind of thing. And B, to some degree, just trying to make sure that really, truly terrible stage designs are not allowed. But that comes at a cost. There is an element where the more that you chop off the bottom end of the options, the more you chop off the top end too. And so, the question is there a way that we can widen the range? So yes, maybe some of these new rules would be theoretically used by bad match directors to make bad stages. Sure. But they don't need any help. Bad match directors are going to find ways to make bad stages or just straight up illegal stages anyway. So to some degree, I don't want to optimize the whole sport around trying to catch those guys. But I do think that it would be interesting just to look around and say, what are the challenges that are valid, enforceable shooting challenges that USPSA rules do not currently allow? And is there a way that we can update the rules or allow some kind of one-off variance or exception for a given match? If somebody did want to run a tactical games USPSA hybrid, what would that look like? Could they come up with some kind of scoring system or whatever it would be, some kind of procedural, some kind of written stage brief that would mandate the kind of challenges that sometimes you see at a tactical games or a brutality match or something like that? What would it look like? I'm not saying it's a good idea. I'm just saying I think it's an interesting conversation to have, because the more inflexible USPSA is as a rule set, the more people will just go around it. They'll say, well, USPSA doesn't allow me to do what I want to do, so I'm going to make my own thing. And if we had a way that somebody could, call it a remix or a, USPSA plus match where, yes, all the USPSA rules apply, and then this one sheet of paper is all the stuff that's non-standard. This is what you got to know. And, maybe that one sheet of paper is they have a new division that is guns that fit in a Glock 19 size box or smaller. Or, just let, to some degree, have a way for matches to experiment within the framework of USPSA, saying, yes, all the USPSA rules still apply. You have all of those sort of protections and guarantees and ambiguities resolved, but we just have this little bit extra that we're doing. And again, all this has to go to NROI, and they have to keep tabs on it just so they can rein in the really crazy stuff. If somebody, is making like 357 Magnum revolver division that that headshots on, just something really goofy. But as long as it's published ahead of time and the competitors know what the rules are, to me, that's fine, right? If people know what they're signing up for and they sign up and they decide to shoot that match knowing that the rules are USPSA plus this variance, I don't see a reason to forbid that. I think finding a way to allow that, where if someone does want to set up some kind of, tactical physical exercise plus USPSA match, and everybody who knows what they're paying their, $200 for or whatever, knows what they're signing up for, that they understand that it's not a pure USPSA match, it's USPSA with these variances or with this additional rule set or whatever. I think there's something interesting to be done there. And I think reaching out to other sports and sort of finding a way that if they wanted to, they could run matches under our rules with variances. I think it's an interesting topic. It's, as I watch match videos from non-USPSA matches, my brain just sort of thinks, okay, if we wanted to codify this, what would that look like? How would we make this what rules would we have to write to try and make this something that USPSA could encompass? And I think it's an interesting topic. It's something that I think about, and I figured it'd be an interesting digression for this evening and start some interesting conversation and hopefully give you something to think about on your drive to the match this weekend or drive to practice or wherever it is that you're going while you listen to this. So that wraps up this episode of Short Course. If you want to get in touch with me, my email is ben@berryshooting.com. Talk to you next time.